Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's been a pretty long day so far. Gosh, amazing content here at AIDC 21. And we're almost wrapped up for the day. We've got this and one more panel session left to go. Again, I'm going to introduce you to Gwen Navarrete Clapperich. She is located in Honolulu, Hawaii. Thanks so much earlier for sharing with us, Gwen, with Microsoft accessibility tools. And now in this one, we're going to be talking about UDL, Universal Design for Learning. You're going to be kind of defining it and letting us know a lot more about what UDL is. I want to mention real quick, we did have a session, I think it was last week, with Dr. Suzanne Ehrlich, who talked about UDL and the Unite Design Lab at the University of Northern Florida, which was a great conversation. I'll grab the link to that one and post it in the chat for folks that might want to check that one out too. But with that, Gwen, I'm going to go ahead and just hand it all over to you, and I'll be waiting for you behind the scenes if you need any help or if any questions come up, okay?
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, everybody, for sticking it out this far. Again, for those of you who need a visual description, I am a Filipino woman wearing red glasses and a black top, and I'm coming to you from my home office in Kapolei, Hawaii, with a bookshelf behind me and a blue curtain to my right. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Share screen. For those of you who need translation services or closed captioning, I invite you to scan the QR code that is to your right of the screen, or you can join us at the URL that's there. But basically, if you download Microsoft Translator, that is the conversation code that you can use, or you can scan the QR code and it will pull up either closed captioning in English or it will be supported in another language of your choosing. So I'll give a couple of seconds for that. And then I will move on to designing inclusive training and really going beyond accessibility to reach all learners. And I want to start with a story of how I got here. A couple of years ago, I was in charge of redesigning a tour guide certification program for one of the community colleges out here in Hawaii. And the first class that I had the opportunity to observe was pretty text heavy, and that's because the class covered a lot about Hawaiian language, history, and culture. Unfortunately, a gentleman approached me during the break and he said to me, "I don't know what I'm going to do to be able to pass this class and get my certification. I've been doing this job for X number of years, but I can't read. And if I don't get the certification, I'm going to lose my job. What do I do?" What would you have done? I was taken aback because I had not prepared for this. I had no idea that I would have somebody with this type of challenge in the class. Who thinks of that? And kudos to him for having the guts to be able to come up and tell me this. But it really took me down this path of trying to learn, like, how do I incorporate accessibility, not just the technology part of it, but how do I incorporate it into the designing of my training so that it would actually, be able to reach people with these types of learner challenges. And that brought me to Universal Design for Learning, as Luis mentioned earlier. Now, I'm going to cover just the basics of it. We only have a short amount of time. There are people who are experts in this field. I am just learning it, but I want to share with you what I've learned. Universal Design for Learning is based off of a concept called universal design. And that's basically a broad spectrum of ideas that deals with spaces, environments, and products. So I'll give you an example of universal design. There is something out there that was designed specifically for people who use wheelchairs, but all of us use. Can anybody think of what that is? If you guessed curb cuts or wheelchair ramps, you would be correct. This is something that was designed specifically for people who have mobility challenges. But if you think about it, who else uses it? Parents with strollers, skateboarders, delivery drivers, Basically, anybody who is carting anything around on wheels will use a curb cut or a wheelchair ramp to get to the destination where they need to go to. Here's another example of universal design. Texting was originally developed for people who were deaf or hard of hearing. Who benefits from texting? Who uses texting now? All of us. So again, something that was designed specifically for people with disabilities benefits everybody else as well. And universal design is sort of similar to design thinking, only that universal design actually concentrates more on accessibility, and design thinking concentrates a little bit on innovative thinking. And here's an example of when both principles were used. This is the OXO peeler, and it was actually designed by somebody who used design thinking principles to design a better vegetable peeler for his wife who had arthritis. And the OXO grip or the OXO peeler is so popular nowadays that you can find it at Target, Walmart. Most of their, stores that sell kitchenware will have this type of peeler. And when we think about universal design for learning, we all have to ask ourselves, why should we care about it, and why should we care about accessibility for all of our learners? The universal design for learning, I like to think of as, and somebody gave me this analogy once, where it's almost like going to a restaurant. When you have universal design for learning, everybody who goes to a restaurant can make accommodations, right? You can usually ask for substitutions. You can usually ask for something that's a vegan option or a gluten-free option. Or when you go to a buffet, you can make your own plate. And everybody has an equal experience, even though people have different plates in front of them. But unfortunately, most training is designed as a prefixed menu where you sit down and it's a 4-course meal that's determined for you, very little substitutions or accommodations allowed. And so when we think about universal design for learning, we're trying to think about how can we provide the first type of service, which is allowing people to have that same type of experience, but giving them individualized attention or individualized design. And universal design for learning, when we think about those learner challenges, we're thinking about a whole array of things, not just disability. So yes, we do have the sensory disabilities, like people who have vision impairment or hearing impairment. We do have people who use wheelchairs or have other mobility issues, like maybe they can't grasp or they have a prosthetic limb. But there are other types of learner diversity or learning challenges that we need to take into account when we're designing our training. So for example, there's that hidden learner challenge, like the gentleman who couldn't read. There's low literacy. There's people with autism and people with ADHD, people with mental illness, people who have chronic illness. And people with low literacy and hidden disabilities, if you're honest with yourself and think about it to yourself, if you had one of those challenges, would you be willing to disclose that to your employer or to your trainer for that matter? Not very many people will. But as trainers, it's our responsibility to try to reach as many people as possible. And when we're thinking about learner challenges, so yes, the literacy rate in the world is about 86%, but did you know that about 54% of people in the US only read at a 5th grade reading level or below? Think about the people in our class. Who does that relate to? We're also thinking about digital literacy because those people who have low literacy traditionally are shy away from technology. And about 24% of people in the world do not know how to use a computer at all. And most of the rest of us are kind of at that medium to low stage. There's really only about 30% of people in the population of the world who consider themselves to be very strong users of computers. And so we need to think about that as well when we design our training, especially nowadays with COVID when a lot of it is virtual. And last but not least, we actually need to think about our language and cultural barriers. As of 2014, there were 1.5 billion English language learners around the world. I know that most of us are based in the US right now, but how do we think about those learners, especially with the high amount of immigration and English language learners that we have in our class? So that's why we want to basically think about using UDL, and we'll see the benefits here that are listed here. But I want to give an example of why UDL actually benefits not just people with disabilities or people with learning challenges. When you are looking at an article, say on MSN.com or MSNBC News, You know how a lot of the times you see the video at the top and then below it you actually see the article written as a transcript? How many people would rather listen to the video or watch the video, and how many would actually read the article? Me, I'd rather read the article because for me it's faster and I learn things a little bit more when I read. The same thing happened when I was studying for my master's degree, and I had to listen to a lot of podcasts and audio interviews. Even though I'm not deaf or hard of hearing, at least I don't think I am, I had to really rely on the transcripts of the audio interviews for me to actually learn something. It was easier for me to take that and highlight pieces that came out of it for me to retain information that way. So again, something that was designed for people who are deaf and hard of hearing actually benefited somebody else like me who wasn't deaf or hard of hearing. And lastly, let's think about audiobooks. How many of us listen to audiobooks maybe in the car or on our way to work? You know, those were developed for people who were blind or had low vision and vision impairment, but other people benefit from it. So when we talk about benefits to our learners, when we think about UDL, even though we're designing for quote unquote people on the margins, everybody else in the middle benefits. So we have greater access to presentation content, there's greater opportunities for achievement, and overall learners have greater satisfaction with the learning process. Now, as far as benefits to us as using UDLs for trainers, is that when we think about the accommodations now, as we're designing the class, we don't have to think about it in the future. And it's much easier to do it during the design process than have to go back and rework everything. UDL also gives us tools to consider how and what to present in a systemic and structured manner. Now, I know I just read from the slide and that's considered a training no-no, but I want to push back on that a little bit and think about those people who maybe have vision impairment or low literacy, and how are you communicating what's on that slide to them as well. So those are the benefits as far as for learning and for trainers. Now, UDL is, as a whole, is a framework, and it recognizes variability in learners, and it's a blueprint for creating instructional goals, methods, materials, and assessments that work for everyone. It's not a single one-size-fits-all, but it tries to make accommodations for the various learning barriers and various learning abilities that we all have. Now, there actually is a little bit of work about, using universal design for learning in the workplace and in workplace training. Luis mentioned Dr. Suzanne Ehrlich, and she and Dr. Michelle Bartlett are actually pretty big experts in this, as well as Dr. Jean Marapodi, who is my mentor in UDL. And there's actually an article that was written for Training Industry magazine that talks about how corporate training is designed for people in the middle of the pack, but it's not too advanced and it's not too slow. And that's mostly what training is about. But what UDL asks us to do is expand our horizons and think about, again, those people who are on the quote unquote margins. With UDL, what we try to do is we try to optimize learning opportunities for all. Now, again, this is a hugely broad topic. We are just skimming the tip of the iceberg, and we can't possibly go over everything today, but I will give you some additional resources at the end, and I will make this presentation available for those of you who would like it. The universal design for learning principles are the same as universal design. So there's 7 of them. And the first one is equitable use, meaning that it's used for all learners with diverse abilities, and the design is appealing to everybody. We're also talking about flexibility in use, which accommodates a wide range of preferences and abilities. UDL means that whatever we design should be simple and intuitive to use, meaning that it should be easy to understand regardless of the learner's experiences, their knowledge, their language skills, or their current concentration level. It should be perceptible, which basically means that it communicates necessary info effectively regardless of the surrounding conditions or environments. We should have a high tolerance for error, meaning that we should allow people to make mistakes in our training classes. And basically, it should require low physical effort, minimizing the chance of fatigue. And the last thing is size and space for approach and use. And this basically means that it's mostly for universal design, but it basically means that we're designing things so that it doesn't, regardless of body posture or a body size or mobility, that those things are not a barrier when we design our training. Now, there are three elements in UDL, and I want you to notice that over the next few slides, what I'm going to talk about are options. So we don't have to do all of these things, but there are three elements of UDL that actually correspond to neuroscience and brain activity that I want to go over before we finish. The first is multiple means of engagement. And this is the learning that comes from the part of the brain that says, why are we learning this? In other words, it's with it. What's in it for me? And this stimulates motivation and interest in learning, and it creates purpose and engages the part of the network of the brain that says, well, what's going to keep me challenged, engaged, and interested? And we do this by things about, we do this by clarifying learning objectives and promoting expectations, by recruiting interest. And most of the time, most of us are already doing this because we vary the way that we actually deliver our content. So to keep people engaged, we may do things like group work or role play or activities or demonstrations, things along that nature. And again, I'll give you an example of how this is used in the real world. So I actually happen to train CPR and first aid classes as part of my business. And people, when we talk about multiple means of engagement or multiple means of why people are motivated to take the class, many people are motivated simply because it's something that they need for work. But there are people who are motivated because they've had personal experiences losing people in their family to cardiac arrest and stroke. And that's why they're driven to learn this stuff. So the more we can tap into why people are motivated, the more engaged they are and the more that they're willing to learn. The second element of UDL is multiple means of representation. And this is the learning that comes from the part of the brain that says, what are we learning? And it's the recognition network. It's basically how we gather facts and categorize what we see, hear, and read. It's how we recognize words and phrases and numbers and images and how it's familiarized with it and how our brain categorizes it. It's basically how we become resourceful and knowledgeable learners. So to do this, we do things like we clarify vocabulary and symbols. We want to promote understanding across all languages. And we want to do illustrations with multiple media and give alternatives to visuals and audios. And we also want to customize information and increase comprehensiveness by highlighting patterns, critical features, big ideas, and relationships. Now, to give multiple means of representation is to provide basically multiple means of promoting the materials for diverse learning needs. And I hear a beep, so I'm going to pause sharing my screen for a second here. Okay. Okay, I think I lost everybody for a second. Am I back? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I just all of a sudden got a beep that said I was offline. So I will go back to. Thank you for your patience, everybody. So we were at multiple means of representation. And again, most of us are doing all of this. We do this by giving things like lecture, or we change things up with video, with audio, with infographics, things along those lines, just to break things up and make things a little bit more interesting. That's really what we mean by multiple means of representation. It's not just one form of medium that we actually do. And that's actually what most of us are doing already in our training classes. The third element of UDL is what we call multiple means of action and expression. And this is how I actually think that we can make the most impact as trainers, and I'll tell you why. Multiple means of action and expression basically is the part of the brain that says, how are we learning it? And it involves a strategic network that indicates how we plan and perform tasks, organize and express our ideas, and it's the strategy and goals that we use for ourselves as learners. And basically what this means is that this gives people an opportunity to tell us in their own words and in their own way what they've learned and how they've learned it. It's another way to assess learning or checking for understanding. And this is where all those things where if as long as the learning objective is met, I'm not really hung up on how they tell me that they've learned. And I'll give you an example for this. Couple of examples. When I first started my business, my son was actually in college, and he happens to be autistic, and he was taking a class on biology, I think it was, and he was required to write a 5-page paper on mangrove trees. And he was really frustrated. And he said to me, why can't I just bring in a mangrove tree and do a presentation and talk about all the features on the mangrove tree like I know, because it's difficult for me to write a paper. And I didn't have an answer for him, because the objective of the exercise was not to write a research paper. The objective of the exercise was for him to tell the instructor what he had learned about mangrove trees. And the same goes for our training classes. How do we actually let people express to us that they are learning, rather than just giving them a quiz or giving them a drag and drop or giving them an exercise or a learning activity? Are we allowing them to tell us in their own words what they've learned and how they've learned it? So I've done this actually pretty successfully in a supervisor class that I do, in which I actually give an exercise on how to manage your former peers. And what I do is I give out all this information to small groups small group activity. And what they do is that they learn the material that's in there, and then they teach back what they have learned to the rest of the class. But they can do it in whatever format they want to. So I've actually had people do a PowerPoint presentation. I've had groups just write on a whiteboard or do use newsprint. I have had people actually act out a sketch to let us know what they've learned. Or they may have driven, like somebody actually did an infographic on a poster board. So it's really depending upon what they feel is the best way to tell you what they've learned. And I think that this is actually how we can make the most impact as trainers, and where I think most of our training is not lacking, but could use a little bit more of a boost. Okay. And you'd be surprised what people can come up with in about 20 minutes of class time, as far as letting them express to you what they've learned and how they've learned it. So examples of using multiple means of expression, again, are exactly what I say. You can do oral or verbal replay. You can do written documentation. You can ask for digital responses. You can ask for videos. You can ask for a presentation, etc. And I realized that most of the examples that I've given apply to synchronous in-person presentations, but this can be applied in a virtual world. Multiple means of representation, again, just means accessibility must be used. We've got the example of reading transcripts or audio interviews. We've got multiple means of engagement, and this is mostly done through what we're already doing now, which is, interactivity with synchronous e-learning. And then we've got the multiple means of action and expression, which is, again, helping them give us options to tell us what they've learned and how they've learned it. And that is the tip of the iceberg of what we can do as far as universal design for learning and training. And what I'd like to do at this point is I'd like to open it up for questions. Now, again, there is a lot of material out there on universal design for learning. I would encourage everybody to go to CAST.org, which is CAST.org. They're the people who are the Center for Applied Science and Technology. They are the people who actually developed UDL. You can find a lot of resources online about universal design for learning. Again, Dr. Suzanne Ehrlich and Dr. Michelle Bartlett are great resources as well. But at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions, if there are any, and then we can go from there.
Okay, let's see here. Gwen. Okay, Michelle Shea is asking, as a special education K-12 teacher, I developed my instruction using UDL, and we use CAST.org. Do you recommend that website for adult learners?
I do. There's not much research out there about, most of the research out there is from K-12 and post-secondary education. There's not much out there about using UDL in workplace training, which is what Dr. Ehrlich and Dr. Bartlett are actually working on. But I do recommend that you start with CAST.org, because they do have a lot of resources available, and they are starting to look at things like workplace training and how adult learning can actually adapt this. And it has been successfully used in the past.
Nice. I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna paste in a link to the Unite Design Lab that Dr. Ehrlich and Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Margaret are founders of, and just so you know, I posted earlier a link to their broadcast I did with them last week, but they are looking for folks to actually collaborate with and get feedback from for their programs. So check it out. Feel free to reach out to them if you're interested in connecting.
Mm-hmm.
And let's
And I
see.
see that some people are posting some other UDL resources in the chat, so that's great. Thank you.
Oh yeah, very very nice. I Yeah, this is great stuff. I think that's one of the most incredible things about these events that TLEC produces is how many resources are shared amongst the audience. That's like one of my favorite parts of it.
Okay.
Okay. Any questions? Last call for questions. Otherwise, we're gonna let Gwen go and enjoy the rest of her day. I think that's it. Gwen,
I'm curious, what is one thing that people have picked up from this presentation? If you could just put it in the chat real quick. I'm always curious as to what people, and this is again, multiple means of action and expression, right? What have people picked up, or what is the biggest takeaway that you've had?
let's see what we got here. Let me read. If is it okay if I read a couple of
Mm-hmm.
them?
Yeah.
Let's see. Bridget is saying using multiple means of action and expression, providing multiple ways for people to show what they've learned. Leah Chang is saying I'm going to focus on providing choice for assessment for learning. Oops. Oh, and there's a lot more. Um, Holly's saying so much. I'll need a while to process. Let's see, Mary, I'm going backwards here. Mary Grace Swartz is saying multiple means of action and expression. How do you incorporate that into trainings that are asynchronous? Whole company assigned a training to do at a time for their choosing, for example.
So one of the things that I've seen done is you can actually, for example, this actually works for people who also are more experienced than others. And I'll give you an example. So the Red Cross does blended learning for their CPR first aid classes. And one of the things that they do in the online asynchronous portion is right away they're giving out a pre-assessment to say, what do you already know? And they give them a choice as to whether they want to take the pre-assessment, like, whether they want to use the multiple choice or take it in a different way. But basically, if they pass the pre-assessment, then they can skip that part of it at all, or they can go back and review it. They do use multiple ways of, with asynchronous, you can give them a choice of, reading a transcript or typing in a box or drag and drop. I know can be difficult with accessibility, but there is that option as well. So there are ways that you can give choices. Some of it, I mean, it's a little bit more work for us as designers, but even, again, it's just an option. So you can do it within the same assessment. So say you give one assessment and then you give an option of whether, maybe what part of it is multiple choice and part of it is fill in the blank and part of it is free form. Or you can give them the option of uploading a video to tell you what they've learned. So things like that, I think, are ways that we can kind of combat the asynchronous portion of it.
Love it. Couple more here. Christina is saying that she learned that accessibility goes beyond adding closed captions. And then
Mm-hmm.
Bobby Vernon says using transcripts with closed captioning. Sean Powell comments, I am not alone as a learner teacher with needs unlike other folks.
Mm-hmm.
Great stuff. Let's see. Yeah, Bobby adds here, I appreciate the story about the person who couldn't read but needed the certification for his job. What we do changes lives. A powerful story to remember. Let's see. Chris Willis, accessibility is so much more than making your training work with screen readers. Definitely. Okay.
Right. Some good stuff in the chat.
Yeah. Well, Gwen, thanks again for this second session. I really appreciate your contribution to today's events. It's been wonderful having you here. Can people contact you after the event has wrapped?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn, or I will type in my email address into the chat. So
Yeah, add that in there, and I'll be sharing, of course, all the recordings after the event wraps up. You can actually go back and look at the recordings now. They're in there, so you can watch some of the content. And I'm not going to be closing this AirMeet instance probably until Monday. So if you want to go back and look at the recordings back here in this platform. Um, you'll be able to access it over the weekend, and then come Monday I'm going to be shutting it down, and then I'll take all those recordings, put them somewhere else for you guys to be able to check out, and I'll send that to email to all the registered attendees. Yeah. Okay, everyone.
thank you
So
so much, everybody.
yeah, and thanks, Gwen. I'm going to shut this one down. Final session coming up next. We've got a panel with, I don't know, what do we have? 5 speakers or so. And Kayleen Holt is going to be hosting that one. So we'll see you in about 28 minutes or so. Last session, it's going to be great. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.